Nathan Marlowe had always been a man of quiet determination. A former Marine, he had spent years serving his country, and the scars, both visible and invisible, were reminders of the sacrifices he'd made. The most obvious reminder was the prosthetic leg he'd worn since losing his right one in combat. Despite everything, Nathan had carved out a life for himself in the suburbs of a small town, a place where he hoped he could finally enjoy some peace. His home, a modest single-story house with a small garage, was his sanctuary. It wasn't extravagant, but it was a symbol of stability that he had fought hard to reclaim after the chaos of war. The property came with an allocated handicap parking spot just a few feet from his front door. This wasn't merely a convenience, it was a necessity. The parking space allowed him to get in and out of his truck without risking the uneven ground of the neighborhood's public streets. For Nathan, it was part of maintaining his independence, something he valued more than almost anything else. His life had settled into a comfortable routine: mornings spent in his garage restoring old motorcycles, afternoons tinkering with small woodworking projects, and evenings enjoying the quiet hum of the neighborhood. But all of that began to unravel one unremarkable Tuesday evening. Nathan had been out running errands in town, stocking up on tools and supplies for a new project he'd been planning, a custom-built workbench for his garage. As he turned the corner onto his street, he immediately noticed something was off. The familiar blue and white sign designating his parking spot for disabled individuals was gone. In its place stood a new, brightly colored sign that read, "Reserved for administrative use." For a moment, Nathan thought he must have made a mistake. Perhaps he was looking at the wrong space. But as he pulled into his driveway and glanced again, the truth hit him like a gut punch. He parked his truck and limped over to the spot, his prosthetic leg clicking softly against the pavement. The sign was bolted firmly into place, and beneath the bold lettering was a smaller line of text: "Unauthorized use subject to fines." Nathan's jaw tightened. This had to be some kind of mistake. No one had contacted him about changes to his parking spot, and the space had been allocated to him when he purchased the house. It was part of the agreement. Frustration began to simmer as he walked back to his truck and grabbed his phone. The number for the neighborhood administration office was programmed into his contacts. He'd had to call them before about minor issues, like the timing of lawn maintenance or trash pickup schedules. But this was different. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it felt like an intrusion into his life, into something that was rightfully his. When he called, he was greeted by a chirpy voice on the other end of the line. "Neighborhood Administrative Office, this is Linda speaking. How can I help you today?" Nathan kept his tone measured, though it took effort. "Hi, Linda. This is Nathan Marlowe. I'm calling about the handicap parking spot in front of my house. The sign's been replaced, and I wasn't notified about any changes. Can you tell me what's going on?" There was a brief pause, followed by the faint clicking of a keyboard. "Let me look that up for you, Mr. Marlowe," Linda said. "Ah, yes, it seems that spot has been reassigned for administrative use. Our records indicate that there was no current documentation on file to confirm your eligibility for a handicap spot. Notices about the update to our parking policies were mailed out last month." Nathan's grip on the phone tightened. "I didn't receive any notice," he said, his voice low but firm. "And I don't understand what you mean by current documentation. I provided all the necessary paperwork when I bought this house." That spot was included in the agreement. Linda's voice remained annoyingly pleasant, as though she was discussing something trivial. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Marlowe, but as of this year, new policies require updated documentation to confirm continued eligibility. If you believe there's been a mistake, you can submit an appeal through our office. I'd be happy to email you the forms." Nathan closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "I'll be down there in person tomorrow," he said curtly, ending the call before she could reply. He felt the anger bubbling just beneath the surface, but he forced himself to stay calm. Losing his temper wouldn't solve anything. That night, Nathan sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by the neatly organized files he'd kept since buying the house. He found the original agreement, the document that clearly outlined his rights to the handicap parking spot. It was dated and signed by both him and the neighborhood administration at the time of purchase. Yet now they were claiming that it wasn't enough. As he reviewed the paperwork, A nagging thought began to creep into his mind. This didn't feel like a simple oversight. The fact that the space had been reassigned to administrative use made it clear that someone had decided his needs weren't a priority. The next morning, Nathan drove to the administrative office. The building was small and unassuming, tucked between a dry cleaner and a pharmacy in the town's modest commercial district. Inside, the receptionist, a woman with meticulously styled hair and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, greeted him with the same chirpy tone he recognized from the phone call. "I'm here to speak with someone about my parking spot," Nathan said, keeping his voice steady. The receptionist's smile faltered slightly, but she gestured toward a set of chairs. "Have a seat, Mr. Marlowe. Someone will be with you shortly." Nathan sat down, his hands resting on the folder of documents he'd brought with him. As he waited, he noticed a bulletin board on the far wall displaying cheerful posters about community events, alongside a neatly pinned flyer about new parking regulations. The fine print mentioned the need for annual verification of eligibility for reserved spots. He frowned. There was no mention of this when he had purchased his house. After nearly half an hour, a man in a tailored suit emerged from the back office. He introduced himself as Greg Harper, the new neighborhood administrator. Greg's handshake was firm but impersonal, and his tone was clipped as he invited Nathan into his office. Nathan laid out his concerns, showing Greg the original agreement and explaining how the parking spot was essential for his daily life. But Greg barely glanced at the documents before leaning back in his chair and delivering his verdict. "Mr. Marlowe," he said, "I understand your frustration, but the policies are clear. Without updated documentation proving your eligibility, we cannot guarantee your access to that spot. These policies are in place to ensure fairness for everyone in the community." Nathan stared at him, disbelief mingling with anger. "Fairness," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm a disabled veteran, and that spot is a necessity for me. This isn't about fairness, this is about convenience for you and your office." Greg's expression didn't change. "If you'd like to appeal, you're welcome to submit the required documentation through the proper channels." Nathan left the office feeling both humiliated and furious. This wasn't just about a parking spot anymore. It was about being told, yet again, that his needs didn't matter, that his service and sacrifices could be dismissed with a shrug. As he got into his truck, he made a silent promise to himself. He wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. Nathan spent the entire night poring over the paperwork he had meticulously kept since purchasing his home. His frustration was mounting, and with every page he flipped through, he became more certain that something deeper was at play. It wasn't just about bureaucracy or forgotten paperwork, this was a deliberate action, and the smug indifference of Greg Harper only cemented that feeling. The neighborhood administration wasn't disorganized, they were targeting him. But why? That question churned in his mind as he pulled out every agreement, receipt, and email correspondence related to his home and the parking spot. His hands tightened around the signed property agreement from years earlier. The wording was unambiguous. The handicap spot in front of his home was designated specifically for his use as part of his purchase. The next morning, Nathan wasn't about to let them brush him off with legal jargon or vague policies. He parked his truck in the empty handicap spot, now marked with the administrative use sign, and made his way to the neighborhood administration office once again. He entered with the folder of documents tucked tightly under his arm, his steps deliberate and his face set with determination. Inside, Linda, the receptionist from the day before, was mid-conversation with someone on the phone, her voice overly cheerful. She gave Nathan a quick, forced smile as he approached the desk. "Good morning, Mr. Marlowe," she said, covering the receiver with her hand. "I believe Greg mentioned he's already spoken with you about this issue." Nathan wasn't interested in her pleasantries. "I need to see him again," he said firmly. Linda's smile wavered slightly. "I'm afraid Mr. Harper is in a meeting this morning. If you'd like, I can leave him a message." "I'm not leaving until I talk to him," Nathan interrupted, his voice calm but commanding. The receptionist hesitated before sighing and gesturing to the same row of chairs he had sat in the day before. "Please have a seat, and I'll see what I can do." Nathan sat down but kept his eyes fixed on the hallway that led to the office doors. He wasn't about to be ignored. After nearly 40 minutes, Greg Harper finally emerged, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Marlowe," he greeted, his tone clipped. "I wasn't expecting you this morning. What can I help you with?" Nathan rose and followed Greg into his office without a word. Once the door was shut, Nathan placed the folder of documents on the desk in front of him. "I've brought everything," Nathan said, his voice steady. "Every piece of paperwork that proves my right to that parking spot. The agreement I signed when I bought the house, the receipts for my taxes, and even the original email confirming the designation of that space. Now, I want to know why you think you can just take it away." Greg leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. He didn't even glance at the documents Nathan had laid out. Instead, he let out a sigh, as if the conversation was exhausting him. "Mr. Marlowe, as I've explained before, the neighborhood policies have changed. We've implemented new requirements for handicap spaces to ensure that all community resources are distributed fairly. Without updated documentation from you, there's nothing I can do." Fairly, Nathan shot back, his voice rising slightly. "What's fair about taking away a spot that I've had for years, one that I rely on to live my life? And don't give me that nonsense about documentation. I gave you everything when I bought this house, and you know it." Greg's expression didn't change. "The updated policies are clear, Mr. Marlowe. If you'd like, I can provide you with a copy of the appeal form." Nathan felt his patience fraying. "This isn't about policies, is it?" he said, his tone sharp. "That spot wasn't reassigned because of a policy change. It was reassigned because someone decided it was more useful to you or one of your friends. Who's using it now? What's so important that it overrides my rights?" Greg's carefully neutral mask slipped slightly, and Nathan caught the faintest flicker of irritation in his eyes. "I suggest you tread carefully, Mr. Marlowe. This is a matter of administrative procedure, not personal grievances." Nathan's temper flared. "The only grievance I have is with people like you who think they can push someone around just because they can. You're messing with the wrong guy, Harper. I'm not going to let this go." Greg's lips pressed into a thin line, and his voice dropped an octave. "If you'd like to escalate this further, you're welcome to consult a lawyer. But unless you can provide the required documentation, that parking spot is no longer yours." Nathan stood, his jaw clenched. "You better believe I'll be talking to a lawyer," he said, grabbing his folder and heading for the door. As he walked out of the office, Nathan felt a knot of anger and frustration tightening in his chest. He had expected resistance, but Greg's smug indifference had only confirmed what he'd suspected. This wasn't about policies or documentation. This was about power and control. Later that afternoon, Nathan sat down with his lawyer, Jessica Monroe, a no-nonsense woman who had a reputation for taking on cases involving housing disputes. Jessica listened intently as Nathan explained the situation, flipping through the documents he'd brought. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "This is definitely a violation of your rights," she said. "Your original agreement clearly states that the handicap parking spot is part of your property's designation. The new policy doesn't override that agreement unless they can prove you signed something consenting to the changes." "I didn't sign anything," Nathan said firmly. "I didn't even know about these changes until the sign was already replaced." Jessica nodded. "That works in our favor. They'll have a hard time justifying this in court. But I'll be honest with you, Nathan, this might not be a quick fight. Neighborhood administrations like this know how to drag things out, and they'll try to wear you down." "I'm not backing down," Nathan said. "This isn't just about me. If they can do this to me, they'll do it to someone else next." Jessica smiled faintly. "That's the spirit. I'll start drafting a demand letter and see if we can get them to back off before this escalates to court. But in the meantime, keep documenting everything. If they try anything else, fines, threats, anything, let me know immediately." Nathan left her office feeling slightly more hopeful, but that hope was short-lived. When he got home, he found a letter waiting for him in his mailbox. It was from the neighborhood administration, and the tone was even colder than before. The letter accused him of unauthorized use of community property and included a $500 fine for parking his truck in the reserved spot that morning. Nathan's hands shook as he read the letter, his anger boiling over. They were escalating, just as Jessica had warned. But he wasn't going to let them win. He was a Marine, and he'd faced tougher battles than this. As he crumpled the letter in his hand, he made a silent vow. Whatever it took, he was going to fight back. This wasn't just about a parking spot anymore. It was about standing up to people who thought they could trample over someone just because they had the power to do so. Nathan wasn't about to let that happen, not to him, and not to anyone else. Nathan woke up the next morning to the sound of his phone buzzing relentlessly. It wasn't the type of morning where he could ignore it and let it ring out. He already knew this wasn't going to be a good day. As he groggily reached for the phone, the screen showed an unknown number. His gut told him to answer, and when he did, a curt voice on the other end immediately launched into a monotone, professional spiel. "Mr. Marlowe, this is Linda from the neighborhood office. We've received complaints regarding unauthorized use of community resources, specifically the parking space in question, as outlined in the letter you received yesterday. Continued violations will result in additional fines or potential legal escalation. I'm calling to remind you to refrain from parking in that space until your eligibility is properly verified." Nathan felt his jaw tighten as her words sunk in. He hadn't parked in the spot since yesterday, and yet here they were, hounding him already. He forced himself to stay calm, but his patience was wearing thin. "I understand the message, Linda," he said tersely, "but let me remind you that the parking spot is mine, and I have every intention of proving that in court. Until then, I suggest you save the threats and focus on explaining why the original agreement I signed suddenly doesn't mean anything." Linda paused for a moment, her usual chipper tone replaced by something colder. "I'm simply informing you of the current policies, Mr. Marlowe. Any further concerns can be addressed through our office during regular hours. Good day." The line went dead before Nathan could respond, leaving him staring at his phone with a mix of frustration and disbelief. He tossed the device onto the kitchen counter and poured himself a cup of coffee, but the bitter taste couldn't distract him from the gnawing feeling in his gut. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding anymore, this was war, and they were coming at him from every angle. Later that day, Nathan decided to park his truck in his driveway rather than give the neighborhood office another excuse to harass him. As he backed into the narrow space, he noticed something unusual near the edge of his property. At first, it looked like nothing more than trash, a crumpled piece of paper lying in the dirt near the base of his mailbox. But as he got out of the truck and walked closer, he realized it wasn't trash at all. It was a folded envelope, and it had no return address. Cautiously, Nathan picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a hastily scrawled message. "They've done this before. Don't let them win." There was no name, no signature, no other information. Nathan scanned the area, looking for anyone who might have left the note, but the street was empty. Whoever had delivered it was long gone. His first instinct was skepticism. It could be a prank or some kind of trap. But the more he thought about it, the more it started to make sense. Someone else in the neighborhood must have been watching what was happening to him, and they knew something he didn't. Nathan tucked the note into his pocket and walked back into the house, his mind racing. He sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the words again, replaying the past few days in his head. The dismantling of his parking spot, the sudden appearance of the new sign, the fines, the letters, it all felt deliberate. But now there was a new layer to consider. If this had happened to someone else before, then there was a pattern. And if there was a pattern, there was a reason. The next few days brought more frustration. A new letter arrived, this time accusing Nathan of disrupting community order by leaving tools outside his garage while working on a project. A small fine was attached to the letter, though it was clear that the penalty wasn't about money, it was about sending a message. The harassment wasn't stopping, and Nathan could feel the weight of it starting to settle on his shoulders. But then came another break. Late one evening, as Nathan was locking up his garage, he saw a figure lingering across the street. At first, he thought it might be one of the neighbors taking a late walk, but something about the way the person moved made him uneasy. The figure didn't seem to be walking anywhere, they were standing still, almost like they were watching him. Nathan stood in the shadows of his garage door, his hand instinctively moving to his pocket where his phone was. He contemplated snapping a picture, but before he could act, the figure turned and walked away quickly, disappearing into the darkness. The next morning, Nathan checked his security camera footage, hoping to catch a clearer view of the figure, but the angle of the camera didn't give him much to work with. It was clear, however, that whoever it was hadn't just been a random passerby. They had been standing on the sidewalk for nearly 10 minutes, watching his house. Fueled by a mix of paranoia and determination, Nathan decided it was time to take things to the next level. He reached out to Jessica, his lawyer, and provided her with the note and the security footage. Jessica was quick to connect the dots. "This isn't random," she said firmly. "Someone clearly has a vested interest in keeping you off that parking spot, and if this note is to be believed, they've done it before. I'll dig into the records and see if there have been any similar disputes in your neighborhood over the past few years." While Jessica worked on the legal side of things, Nathan focused on protecting himself. He upgraded his security cameras, adding additional coverage of his driveway and the front yard. He also started keeping detailed logs of every interaction with the neighborhood office, every letter he received, and every strange occurrence around his property. Then, one evening, something happened that shook him to his core. As he returned home from a trip to the hardware store, he found his truck blocked in by a small stack of cinder blocks that had been neatly arranged in the middle of his driveway. On top of the stack was a piece of paper weighted down with a rock. Nathan stepped out of the truck and approached cautiously. The paper bore a single word, written in bold, blocky letters: "Stop." The message was clear, but Nathan wasn't the type to back down. He grabbed the paper and the blocks, tossed them aside, and went straight into his house. His phone buzzed with a text from Jessica just as he locked the door. "Found something," the message read. 2 years ago, similar case in your neighborhood. Same office. Resident lost their spot to administrative use. I'm looking into who got it." Nathan's pulse quickened. The pieces were starting to come together, but there was still so much he didn't know. Someone was playing a long game, and he was determined to find out why. But for now, he did the only thing he could. He documented the cinder blocks, logged the incident in his growing file of harassment, and sent everything to Jessica. This wasn't just about a parking spot anymore. It was about uncovering the truth and making sure that whoever was behind this would regret underestimating him. Nathan sat at his kitchen table, his growing stack of evidence spread out in front of him like the pieces of an unsolvable puzzle. His lawyer, Jessica, had called earlier that morning with an update. She had uncovered a disturbing pattern of similar incidents in the neighborhood. Over the past 5 years, at least 3 other residents had lost their designated parking spots or portions of their property under eerily similar circumstances. Each time, the justification was tied to administrative reallocation or compliance with updated policies. In every case, the residents eventually either sold their homes or abandoned their claims after months of fines, threats, and escalating pressure from the neighborhood office. This wasn't incompetence or bureaucratic mismanagement. It was calculated. Someone in the neighborhood administration was deliberately targeting certain residents, and Nathan had every reason to believe he was their latest victim. Jessica's findings only added fuel to the fire. One of the previous victims had been an elderly widow who had fought the office for nearly a year before finally selling her home. Her property had been purchased by none other than Greg Harper himself, under the guise of a private real estate investment. Nathan clenched his fists as he reread the name. Harper. Of course, it all came back to him. The smug neighborhood administrator had been dismissive and patronizing from the very beginning, and now it was clear why. This wasn't just about power, it was about profit. Harper had a vested interest in pushing certain residents out and reallocating their properties. Nathan couldn't prove it yet, but he was getting closer. The knock at the door startled him out of his thoughts. He wasn't expecting anyone, and the last thing he wanted was another confrontation with someone from the neighborhood office. He glanced at the security monitor by the door, which displayed a grainy feed from the camera mounted outside. The figure standing on his porch was unfamiliar, a man in his early 50s, wearing a baseball cap and a weathered jacket. Nathan opened the door cautiously, keeping one hand on the edge of the frame. "Can I help you?" The man shifted nervously, glancing over his shoulder before speaking. "You don't know me, but I've been watching what's happening to you," he said, his voice low. "Name's Roy. Used to live a few blocks over. Same thing happened to me 2 years ago. Thought maybe you'd want to know what you're up against." Nathan studied him for a moment, trying to gauge his sincerity. Roy's posture was tense, and there was a weariness in his eyes that Nathan recognized. It was the look of someone who had been through a battle and lost. "Come in," Nathan said finally, stepping aside to let him in. Roy entered cautiously, his eyes darting around the room, as if he expected someone to be watching. He didn't sit down until Nathan gestured to one of the chairs at the kitchen table. "I'll get straight to the point," Roy began. "The people running this neighborhood office? They're not just pushing papers and enforcing rules, they're running a racket. They pick targets people who they think won't fight back, and they squeeze them until they either give up or leave. Then they scoop up the property and sell it off. That's what happened to me." Nathan leaned forward, his frustration boiling over into anger. "So Harper's behind all of this?" Roy nodded. "Him and a couple of his cronies on the board. They use the rules as a weapon. Change policies without notice, send fines for made-up violations, stall your appeals until you're out of options. They'll do whatever it takes to make your life miserable." Nathan frowned. "Why me? Why now? I'm not exactly sitting on a gold mine here." Roy shook his head. "It's not about the house itself. It's about the land. They've been rezoning parts of the neighborhood bit by bit. Your place? It's in the path of some big redevelopment project they've been working on. A new office complex or something. They don't want you here because you're in the way." Nathan sat back in his chair, the weight of Roy's words sinking in. It explained so much: the relentless harassment, the sudden disappearance of his parking spot, the escalating fines. But it also raised more questions. How far were these people willing to go to get what they wanted, and how many others had been victims of their schemes? Roy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I kept this from when it happened to me," he said, sliding it across the table. "It's a copy of the notice they sent me when they took my parking spot. Look familiar?" Nathan unfolded the paper and immediately recognized the layout, the wording, even the tone. It was almost identical to the letters he'd been receiving. "They didn't even bother to change the format," he muttered bitterly. "Why would they?" Roy said with a bitter laugh. "They know most people won't fight back. And the few who do, they get buried in paperwork and legal fees until they can't take it anymore." Nathan's grip on the paper tightened. "Well, they picked the wrong guy this time." Over the next few days, Nathan and Jessica began piecing together a more complete picture of Harper's operation. Jessica filed a formal complaint with the County Housing Authority detailing the harassment and potential corruption. But they both knew that wasn't going to be enough. Harper and his associates had covered their tracks well, and it was unlikely that any official investigation would move fast enough to make a difference. Nathan decided to take matters into his own hands. He started talking to his neighbors, asking if anyone else had experienced similar issues. Most of them were reluctant to speak up, but a few shared stories that mirrored his own. There was the retired schoolteacher who had been fined for unauthorized landscaping after planting flowers in her front yard. The young couple who had been accused of violating noise ordinances despite never hosting guests. And then there was the elderly man down the street who had quietly moved out last year after losing a lengthy battle over his property taxes. The stories painted a clear picture. Harper and his team were systematically targeting vulnerable residents, using obscure rules and bureaucratic red tape to force them out. Late one night, Nathan was reviewing the footage from his security cameras when he noticed something odd. A car had parked in front of his house for nearly an hour the previous evening. The driver never got out, but the headlights remained off, and the car didn't move until well after midnight. Nathan couldn't make out the license plate from the angle, but the sight of it sent a chill down his spine. He called Jessica immediately. "Someone's watching me," he said, his voice low. "I caught a car on my camera last night. They didn't do anything, but they were sitting out there for over an hour." Jessica didn't hesitate. "Document it. Every time it happens. If they're trying to intimidate you, that's just more evidence for our case. But be careful, Nathan. These people don't play fair." The following morning, Nathan found another note tucked into his mailbox. This one wasn't anonymous. It was from the neighborhood office, informing him that his garage was in violation of community aesthetics due to its outdated paint color. They had attached yet another fine. Nathan stared at the letter, his frustration giving way to a grim determination. Harper and his cronies could throw whatever they wanted at him, he wasn't going anywhere. If they thought they could scare him off with fines and intimidation, they clearly didn't know who they were dealing with. As he taped the new letter into his growing binder of evidence, Nathan felt a renewed sense of purpose. Harper and his team had built their operation on the assumption that no one would push back. But Nathan wasn't like the others. He wasn't going to fold under pressure or walk away quietly. He had spent his life fighting battles far tougher than this, and he wasn't about to lose his home or his dignity without a fight. Nathan's quiet defiance had begun to ripple through the neighborhood, stirring a mix of curiosity, fear, and cautious support among his neighbors. While most kept their distance, a few started to come forward with whispered words of encouragement or small gestures of solidarity, like leaving their porch lights on when they saw him outside at night. These subtle acts reminded Nathan that he wasn't entirely alone, but they also underscored the isolation he still felt. The fight wasn't over, it was only intensifying. The first sign that things were escalating came one chilly morning when Nathan stepped outside to find the tires on his truck slashed. The clean, surgical precision of the cuts made it clear this wasn't some random act of vandalism, it was a message. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the deflated tires, the anger bubbling up inside him. But instead of reacting emotionally, he grabbed his phone and began taking pictures from every angle. The evidence, he reminded himself. Every detail mattered. Nathan called Jessica as soon as he finished documenting the scene. "They've slashed my tires," he said, his voice tight but controlled. Jessica's sigh on the other end of the line betrayed her frustration. "This is exactly the kind of intimidation tactic I was worried about. Did you call the police?" "I'm about to," Nathan said. "But let's be real, there's not much they'll do beyond filing a report." "You're right, but you still need that report. Every incident adds weight to our case. Keep documenting everything, Nathan. Don't let them scare you into making a mistake." Nathan hung up and dialed the non-emergency line for the local police. The officer who arrived was polite but detached, taking a few notes and snapping a couple of photos before promising to file a report. "Probably just some kids messing around," the officer said with a shrug, though the words rang hollow to Nathan. This wasn't kids. This was targeted. Later that afternoon, Nathan had a local mechanic replace the tires. The cost stung, but the inconvenience was even worse. It wasn't about the money, it was about the constant reminders that someone was watching him, trying to break him down piece by piece. 2 days later, another letter arrived in his mailbox. This one accused him of unauthorized modifications to his home after a neighbor allegedly reported seeing tools and equipment outside his garage. The letter included a $1,000 fine and a warning that repeated violations could lead to legal action. Nathan couldn't help but laugh bitterly as he read it. The modification in question was nothing more than a workbench he had set up temporarily while repairing a motorcycle. Nathan called Jessica again, forwarding her a copy of the letter. "They're relentless," he said. "At this rate, they'll fine me for breathing too loudly." Jessica's tone was firm. "This is exactly what they do, Nathan. They pile on fines and complaints until people either give up or go broke fighting back. But this is good, it shows a pattern. The more they come after you, the stronger our case gets." That night, Nathan double-checked the settings on his new security cameras, ensuring they captured every inch of his property. He also set up motion-activated lights around his driveway and garage, determined not to give whoever was targeting him another opportunity to slip by unnoticed. But even with these precautions, the sense of unease lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that things were building towards something bigger. That suspicion was confirmed just a few nights later. It was well past midnight when Nathan was jolted awake by the blaring sound of his motion-activated alarm. He sprang out of bed, adrenaline surging as he grabbed the baseball bat he kept by his bedroom door and hurried to the window. The yard was bathed in harsh, white light from the floodlights, and for a moment everything seemed still. Then he saw a shadow moving near the edge of his driveway. Nathan's heart pounded as he crept toward the front door, keeping his movements quiet. He peeked through the peephole and caught a glimpse of two figures in dark clothing, crouched near his truck. One of them was holding something, a crowbar, maybe, or a tool of some kind. He didn't hesitate. He flung open the door and stepped outside, the bat held firmly in his hands. "Hey," he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. The two figures froze for a split second before bolting, disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of the floodlights. Nathan chased them as far as the edge of his property, but they were too fast, and he wasn't about to risk a confrontation in the shadows. He stopped at the curb, breathing heavily, and scanned the area for any sign of their retreat. When he returned to the driveway, he saw the damage they had left behind. They hadn't been after his truck this time. They had been tampering with the security cameras, trying to disable them. One of the cameras was hanging limply from its mount, the wires severed. Nathan cursed under his breath and immediately began documenting the scene, taking pictures and noting the exact time of the incident. The next morning he called Jessica again, updating her on what had happened. "This is getting dangerous," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "They're not just trying to intimidate you, they're trying to cut off your ability to protect yourself." "I'm not backing down," Nathan said firmly. "If anything, this just proves how desperate they are." Jessica hesitated. "Nathan, I'm with you on this, but I need you to be careful. If they're willing to resort to this, there's no telling what they might try next. Have you thought about contacting the media? If we shine a light on this, it might make them think twice." Nathan shook his head, even though she couldn't see him. "Not yet. I don't want this to turn into a circus. Let's keep building the case for now." Over the next week, the harassment continued. More fines, more letters, more petty accusations. But Nathan refused to let it break him. He kept documenting everything, forwarding every piece of evidence to Jessica and adding it to the growing file he kept in his garage. Then, one evening, something happened that changed everything. Nathan was going through his mail when he found an envelope that didn't match the others. It wasn't from the neighborhood office or any official agency. It was plain, unmarked, and sealed with cheap adhesive. Inside was a single photograph. It showed his house, taken from a distance, with a red X drawn over it in marker. Beneath the photo was a typed note, "This is your last chance. Leave." Nathan felt his stomach drop as he stared at the note, the words searing into his mind. This wasn't just intimidation anymore, this was a direct threat. Whoever was behind this was escalating, and they weren't afraid to let him know it. He called Jessica immediately, his voice uncharacteristically shaky. "They've crossed the line," he said, describing the photo and the note. Jessica's response was immediate. "This changes everything, Nathan. We need to involve law enforcement at a higher level. This isn't just about property rights anymore, this is criminal." Nathan agreed, but as he hung up the phone, he felt a cold resolve settle over him. They wanted him to leave. They wanted him to give up, to pack his things and disappear like so many others had before him. But Nathan Marlowe wasn't going anywhere. If they wanted a fight, they were about to get one. The courtroom was stifling, filled with a tense silence that only heightened Nathan's resolve. He sat at the plaintiff's table next to Jessica, his lawyer, while Greg Harper sat across from them, flanked by two attorneys who exuded smug confidence. Harper wore the same arrogant expression Nathan had come to expect, as if the outcome was already decided in his favor. But Nathan wasn't here to play their game. This was his moment to expose the truth and fight back against everything they'd thrown at him. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Jessica wasted no time presenting their case. She methodically laid out the evidence, starting with the original purchase agreement for Nathan's home, which explicitly guaranteed his right to the handicap parking spot. She emphasized that the neighborhood administration's decision to revoke it without notice or cause was not only a breach of contract but a blatant act of discrimination. Jessica's tone was calm but razor-sharp as she moved to the fines and letters. "Your Honor," she said, holding up a stack of documents, "these are the fines Mr. Marlowe received for alleged violations, many of which are baseless. For example, he was fined for so-called unauthorized modifications, which was nothing more than temporarily placing a workbench in his driveway. This is not enforcement of community rules, it's harassment." The judge frowned as Jessica handed over copies of the letters, and Nathan felt a flicker of hope. He had seen that expression before in people who were starting to realize they'd been misled. Harper's lawyers were quick to counter. They painted Nathan as a difficult resident who refused to follow the rules and claimed the updated policies were applied equally to all homeowners. The neighborhood administration acted within its rights, one of the attorneys said. Mr. Marlowe failed to provide the necessary documentation for his handicap parking spot. The rules are clear, and they apply to everyone. But Jessica was ready. If these rules are so clear, she said, then why wasn't Mr. Marlowe informed of the changes before his parking spot was reassigned? And why were those changes conveniently implemented shortly after Mr. Harper's appointment as administrator? She then presented a timeline of events, showing how Harper had quietly pushed through new policies that gave him the authority to reallocate community spaces. Jessica highlighted how similar tactics had been used against other residents, including Roy, the man who had visited Nathan with his own story of losing his parking spot. The turning point came when Jessica called Roy as a witness. Roy took the stand, his voice steady but filled with emotion as he recounted his own experience. He described how he had been pressured to leave his home after months of harassment and escalating fines. I tried to fight back, Roy said, looking directly at the judge, but they buried me in paperwork and made it impossible to keep up. In the end, I didn't have a choice. I sold my home at a loss just to get out. Jessica followed up by asking Roy about the buyer of his home. It was Greg Harper, Roy said, his voice cutting through the courtroom. A murmur rippled through the audience as Harper shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Jessica pressed further, presenting property records that confirmed Harper had purchased Roy's home under a private investment company he owned. This isn't about community rules, Jessica said. This is about Mr. Harper using his position to target residents, force them out, and profit from their misfortune. Harper's lawyers scrambled to object, but the damage was done. Jessica moved to the final piece of evidence, a document recently uncovered through a subpoena of neighborhood administration records. It was an internal email chain between Harper and his colleagues, discussing the need to clear out certain properties for a redevelopment project. Nathan's property was mentioned by name, along with several others. This email proves intent, Jessica said. Mr. Harper wasn't enforcing rules, he was engineering a scheme to drive residents out for personal gain. The judge called for a recess, and Nathan stepped outside the courtroom to catch his breath. Jessica joined him, her face serious but hopeful. We've got them, she said. There's no way they can explain this away. When the court reconvened, Harper's lawyers attempted to downplay the emails, claiming they were taken out of context. But the judge wasn't buying it. She turned her attention to Harper, her voice stern. Mr. Harper, the evidence presented today suggests a clear pattern of abuse of power. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Harper hesitated, his usual confidence cracking under the weight of the scrutiny. Your Honor, he began, but whatever excuse he was about to offer was drowned out by the judge raising her hand. I've heard enough, she said. This court finds that the neighborhood administration acted in bad faith and in violation of Mr. Marlowe's rights. The reassignment of the handicap parking spot is null and void, and all fines levied against Mr. Marlowe are to be rescinded immediately. Nathan felt a wave of relief wash over him, but the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, the evidence of Mr. Harper's actions will be forwarded to the county prosecutor for further investigation. This court cannot and will not tolerate abuse of authority for personal gain. Harper's face turned pale, and for the first time Nathan saw the fear in his eyes. It was a satisfying sight. As the gavel struck and the court adjourned, Nathan shook Jessica's hand, gratitude flooding through him. I couldn't have done this without you, he said. Jessica smiled. You did more than you realize, Nathan. You stood your ground, and that's what made the difference. Nathan left the courthouse that day knowing the fight wasn't over. There would still be fallout, and Harper wasn't the type to go down quietly. But for the first time in weeks, Nathan felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. He had fought for what was right, and he had won. In the days following the court's decision, Nathan finally felt the weight of the battle begin to lift. The neighborhood administration was forced to reinstate his handicap parking spot, and the sign that had been hastily erected for administrative use was removed within 48 hours of the ruling. Watching the maintenance crew reinstall the original blue and white marker was a moment of quiet vindication. Nathan stood on his porch, arms crossed, as they worked. He didn't gloat or say anything he didn't need to. The sign spoke for itself. News of the court's decision spread quickly through the neighborhood. For some, it was a relief to see someone finally stand up to the administration. A few neighbors stopped by to offer their congratulations or share their own frustrations with how things had been run under Harper's leadership. Others, however, were less warm. Nathan noticed that certain neighbors, ones who had previously sided with the administration or kept their distance during the conflict, now avoided eye contact when they passed by his house. He didn't mind. He hadn't fought this battle to win anyone's approval. True to her word, the judge had forwarded evidence of Harper's actions to the county prosecutor. Rumors swirled that an official investigation was underway, and whispers of subpoenas and potential charges began to circulate. Harper, once a looming presence in the neighborhood, was now conspicuously absent. His car, usually parked in the office lot, hadn't been seen in days, and his name was quietly removed from the administration's website. Nathan took no joy in Harper's downfall. The man's greed and abuse of power had been infuriating, but Nathan knew the fight was never about him alone. Harper was just a symptom of a much larger problem, the way the administration had been allowed to operate unchecked for so long. Nathan wanted more than a personal victory, he wanted change. That's why, despite his exhaustion, Nathan attended the next community meeting. The room was packed, and for once the atmosphere wasn't filled with the usual pleasantries and forced smiles. People were angry about how the administration had handled their responsibilities, angry about the corruption that had been exposed, and angry at themselves for not speaking up sooner. When it came time for public comments, Nathan stood up. The room fell silent as he walked to the front. He wasn't used to speaking in front of crowds, but the words came naturally. "I didn't want to fight this battle," he began. "But when they came for something that was rightfully mine, I had no choice. This isn't just about a parking spot. It's about accountability, about making sure this kind of abuse doesn't happen again to me, to you, or to anyone else." A ripple of applause broke out, and Nathan saw nods of agreement throughout the room. By the end of the meeting, a motion had been passed to restructure the administration, with plans to introduce new oversight measures and transparency requirements. The days turned into weeks, and while life in the neighborhood began to settle back into its familiar rhythms, things weren't quite the same. Neighbors who had once been strangers now stopped to chat with Nathan when they saw him outside. The young couple down the street even brought him a homemade pie as a thank you for standing up for everyone. Nathan, for his part, started to feel a sense of belonging that he hadn't before. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast a warm glow over the street, Nathan sat on his porch with a glass of iced tea. His parking spot, now proudly marked with the blue Handicap symbol, was empty for the moment, but it was there waiting for him. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. It was a text from Jessica Harper, officially under investigation. "Couldn't have happened without you." Nathan smiled faintly as he set the phone back down. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, change never was. But for now he allowed himself a moment to enjoy the peace he had fought so hard to reclaim. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Nathan stood up and walked to the edge of his porch, looking out at the street he called home. For the first time in a long while, it truly felt like home again.